Alrighty, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to jump right in with part 2 of our plants. So to do a quick recap, if you missed the last video or just need a refresher, main things I'm going to talk about are plants. The 4 features of them that we have are that they're eukaryotic, so they have a cell nucleus. They have a cell wall made out of cellulose. They're autotrophic, so they make their own energy. I put a little star next to them because there's some that have basically lost this ability through evolution, and instead they're more parasitic, or they feed off of dead or decaying matter, which we gave another term from the first video. And then there's multicellular. Again, there are some exceptions, so algae kind of fit into this unicellular version, but for the most part, what we consider plants are multicellular organisms. Next up, what they need: sunlight. This is for photosynthesis. Gas exchange, so they trade CO2 and oxygen. They also perform cellular respiration, so they need both oxygen and carbon dioxide. They need water, which is a component of photosynthesis. And finally, they need minerals. They need other things to make proteins, enzymes, DNA, etc. And then the last thing I talked about last class, or last lesson, was this sort of life cycle where they spend part of their lives in this sort of a haploid stage where they have one set of chromosomes. So rather than their chromosomes coming in pairs, when they're haploid, they only have one part, and then diploid, where they have 2 sets. Alright, I'm going to start talking about some different forms. So following along with our notes, we're on page 2. So first up we're going to talk about is seedless plants. So these are plants that don't produce seeds. There's a couple of different categories. There's algae, there's something called a bryophyte, which is basically moss or types of mosses. And then finally there are what's referred to as seedless vascularized plants, or vascular plants. And this would be ferns. Alright, first up, what are the characteristics of algae? Biologists apply the term algae to any photosynthetic eukaryote other than a land plant. Some algae are classified as protists and some are as plants. So key bit here, if we are saying something is a green algae, it is a plant. So one of the things it suggests that from fossils, we think that the green algae were some of the first plants on Earth. Now when we say fossils, again, this goes back to that question I talked about where we probably don't have a full complete picture of this because algae is very small. So a lot of the times we would have a very hard time finding fossilized algae, but we could look and find some traces of them in fossilized rock. Secondly, green algae are mostly aquatic and are found in fresh and salt water and in some kind of like pond moist areas on land. So areas that they get a lot of water and they have kind of this continuous flow of water. So think like a swamp or a bog. This is where we would find algae. Due to most green algae being single-celled or branching filaments, they have direct contact with the water that they grow in to absorb nutrients. So they don't have specialized plant tissues that others plants do. So here's sort of a close-up image of algae. This is kind of, if you remember back to our pond water lab, this is maybe one of the types that you've seen. There are a few other types, but basically what the second part is saying is if you have this very thin filament that I'll focus on here, it's going to be surrounded on all sides by water. So if you imagine there's water above, there's water below, and it forms this nice little ring. So if it needs nutrients, it can just pull them from the water. Because if I put a side-on view, I've got the cell here, and then I've got water here. Any sort of nutrients that are in the water don't have very far to go. If you remember when I was talking about insects a while back, how their size is limited by how much oxygen they can take in because they don't have lungs like we do, this is kind of the same thing. If a cell is very close to the medium that it's getting its nutrients and energy from, it doesn't have to rely on specialized tissues like blood vessels or anything like that. In this case, a plant would have different things. It wouldn't have blood vessels, but it would have things like xylem tubes, which we'll talk about in a bit. So because of algae's shape, it doesn't really need to be specialized. Next up, green algae has life cycles like other plants, where it alternates between haploid and diploid. The dominant is the gametophyte. So one of the most important things we're going to talk about is this, which means that its dominant is the one set of chromosomes. And I'll show you a picture for this. So the first part I'll talk about is Chlamydomonas. Single-celled green algae. It can stay in a haploid stage for many generations if the conditions are favorable, and then it reproduces asexually by mitosis. So I'll talk about this in a bit. Here's actually what it looks like here. You can see there's two kind of filaments. I believe those are for swimming around, so it would be flagella or flagelli. If conditions are unfavorable, these organisms can produce gametes which fuse through fertilization to create a sporophyte, which will last until conditions become favorable, then grow through meiosis to create 4 flagellated haploid cells which can reproduce asexually. So, if that sounds confusing, maybe for yourself, draw it here. And I'm sorry about the very bad quality here. Basically, what is happening is, let's start right here. So you have a mature version starting here. If the conditions are good, so I'll put good conditions, I'm going to also split this up. So if conditions are good, like a high water content, lots of nutrients, lots of oxygen, lots of sunlight, it's going to go through this cycle here, where it uses asexual reproduction to produce more of itself. And you can see it produces through mitosis, but it ends up producing multiple times, and you get this sort of zoospore. They call it a zoospore. And it can keep going around in this cycle. Notice how in the color key it is haploid, so it only has one set of chromosomes. Say then it switches and it has bad conditions. So this might be less sun, fewer minerals, you name it. Basically, any condition that's really bad for these things living, because it takes a lot of energy to reproduce through mitosis. If you think about it, you have to basically double all of your organelles, you have to double your mass, and then you split up. That takes a lot of energy to do. So what they do is instead they produce gametes, and then they fuse through sexual reproduction. So they find another of the same organism. They produce a zygote, which would have 2N, so it would have 2 sets of chromosomes. Then meiosis happens, and you end up getting 4 additional mature cells. So notice the only time that it has 2N or is diploid is during a very small period of time. Basically from fertilization, and then it, through meiosis, creates 4 copies of itself, and then those ones are again haploid. So very short period of time. This plant spends most of its time in the haploid stage. Or if you remember the other term, haploid referred to gametophyte, and diploid was a sporophyte. So if you want to think about it, these are technically the things that come out are technically the spores. Although it's probably wrong to call them that. Alright, next up, we're still talking about algae, but many green algae form colonies, which is how we're thinking most multicellular plants might have evolved. So a couple of ones, again, these are ones that you might have seen from the pond water lab. So Spirogyra, a freshwater algae or alga, which forms long thread-like colonies called filaments, are stacked almost like soda cans placed end to end. So here's a good picture. It almost looks a little bit like DNA, or you can see in some of them how it has like little rings attached. The other type that I'm going to show you is called a volvox. This is a green algae. And it forms a colony, and its cells are connected together by strands of cytoplasm, so that stuff inside of our cells, allowing them to communicate. So they can actually talk to each other through chemicals. And because of how this is set up, notice how if you imagine this being a sphere, there's going to be some cells that are very close to the edge and then some cells that are very close to the middle. So some of them are going to be really good at taking in nutrients, and then other ones are going to kind of rely on the ones that are outside to transfer nutrients in. So if I kind of follow a bit of minerals, it's going to go to this one first, and then it might share a little bit to one of the inside ones. So because of this, most of the cells are identical, but some are specialized. And because some cells are specialized, this sort of teeters on this multicellular life to colonial life. This is sort of what we can expect like a pre-sponge to be like. So how sponges had cells that could change their jobs, this is kind of the same thing. Each organism within the colony is technically its own, but because they're specialized, they're also sort of considered maybe one. Alright, I'm going to pause here just to keep it short. I'll pick up next by looking at bryophytes, which are things like mosses. Alright, as always, take care.